Good afternoon, everybody, or depending where you are in the country or in the world, it may be morning to you. So this is Heather George. I'm with the National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS, who's hosting this, along with my colleague Devin Minch. We're both at the University of South Florida and work with Florida's Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support Project. This is the last webinar of our series for the 2016-2017 school year that the PBIS Center has been hosting for our school climate transformation recipients, as well as anybody else who accesses our center resource materials. And so today we're going to be talking about family and community engagement and tiered systems of support. Devin is predominantly going to be presenting most of this information. I view her as a national expert in this area, and I think you guys have a great opportunity, if you have questions, to type them in and to get answers live from Devin as we're going along. As a reminder to everybody, we are recording this session, and this session is going to be posted on the PBIS.org website, along with any supplemental materials. As you can see on the cover of the webinar, you can download the handouts, and the handouts have all been hyperlinked, so everything that Devin's going to be showing you today, you'll be able to click directly on those links within the handouts and go directly to them, which is pretty cool. We're also going to be showing you a couple videos as well. So we've got a lot of content to cover. Like I said, we may have to go fast at certain times, so we are recording this and it will be posted on the PBIS.org website. So as a reminder, if you have questions, if you have comments, please go ahead and type them into the chat box, and we will try to answer them while we're going throughout the presentation today. So let's go ahead and get started. So the objectives for the webinar today is we want to be able to introduce to you the best practices for family and community engagement, also known as FACE, and learn more about the systemic framework for FACE and tiered behavioral frameworks. Also helping to help you understand that there's various approaches, there's a lot of resources out there and a lot of strategies that are going to assist in building local capacity for implementing a systemic approach to FACE. And some of these include how to integrate teaming approaches in your existing infrastructure. So if you are implementing a multi-tiered behavioral framework already, or you've got PBIS established in place, how this fits within it, because we don't want this to be viewed as an additional siloed initiative or activity within our school or within our district. How to develop and align goals and outcomes so that family engagement's connected to your existing goals that you've got, and how to implement tiered family engagement strategies, much like we do for our kiddos, much like we do for teachers that need additional support, much like we do for some of our schools that need additional resources, but then how to align those existing tiered supports by focusing on building positive relationships with our families, empowering families, and using collaborative problem-solving strategies. So I think what's pretty cool is that FACE is another acronym that we're dealing with, but I think it's pretty darn cool to see, like, this isn't something brand new for us. In fact, it's going to be a great resource that we're adding to supplement. You can see it's best practice that fits along with what we've been doing with PBIS. Two main projects we definitely want to acknowledge for the development of the material that Devin's going to be covering today, and that's Florida's Problem-Solving Response to Intervention project. In a nutshell, it's the RTI for Academic project here at the University of South Florida that we work closely with, as well as our Florida's PBS project and the family engagement work group members that we have here at USF, and the various folks who've participated in helping develop this material. So as a reminder, in the file box you can download the resources, and all the PowerPoints are hyperlinked for you within that PDF for easy access. All right, so most of you, or if you don't know, we have an implementation blueprint that's on the PBIS.org website, and we've recently updated this in mid-May. And the implementation blueprint goes through series of various components, but it's all based around the aspect of teaming. And so many of you, depending on where you are, if you're a family member, the goal is hopefully that we would think that the schools have brought you into a team-based process to work around helping to support your child to be successful. If you're a school leader or working in a school, hopefully there is a leadership team that is guiding all of the PBIS efforts that are happening across campus. If you're a district, hopefully there's a district leadership team that is guiding the various activities across the district for PBIS. And as a state, we always talk about state leadership teams and how they're able to best support the various districts out there. So nobody is exempt from PBIS. Nobody is exempt from the actual structure and components and features that we say are essential for successful implementation, but the nature in which how we bring folks together may change varying on the context. So it might look a little different if we're working around an individual student as opposed to if we're a district leadership team trying to figure out all of our various schools. But what I wanted to point out to you is that we've revised this blueprint in mid-May, and we've added in a piece that deals specifically with stakeholder support. Oh, and my just noticed it's not coming up on the screen. Well, let me read it to you. If you go to this website on the pbis.org website and you pull up the implementation blueprint, stakeholder support deals particularly, I think when we think of stakeholders, I think folks, depending on where you're coming from, if you're at district level, we may obviously think about our school board, we think about our community businesses, maybe our politicians, our administrators, but families are definitely a piece that are added or made sure that we have added throughout the blueprint because we've got to have family involvement. They are our consumers. If we don't have kids, we no longer have schools anymore. So we've got to make sure I wanted to point this out to you that these have been added to the blueprint. When we're also talking about disseminating information, our stakeholders are also our family members, and they're assisting in disseminating information. So if you're a school and you're starting to disseminate information about PBIS, what Devin's going to talk to you about are the various strategies. How do you get your families involved with that process? How do you know what types of information that might be relevant for them or even helpful for them in that matter? And then it also gets into talking about, in the blueprint, how the organizational leaders are actively and visibly participating in events and helping to engage the various stakeholders. And so it's making this mindful purpose of how are we going to get everybody on board so that our organization is the most effective. And so just something to point out to you. So if you're coming from state or district and you're maybe used to working with the blueprint, or maybe you were a school and you've filled out the self-assessment for the blueprint and kind of come up with an action plan, just know that it's been revised and we have a lot more information in there, language that deals specifically addressing that parents are in there, families are in there, and they are an equal stakeholder. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Devin now to get into the mechanics of what we were talking about here. And as a reminder, I'm going to mute my microphone right now, but please go ahead and type comments and questions in the chat box and we'll answer as we go. So Devin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Heather. If you guys could just let me know that you can hear me loud and clear. All right. All right, thank you. Good to see some familiar faces are here, or some familiar names, rather. We're going to get started by just kind of establishing a little bit of some common language and common understanding around family engagement and MTSS. Florida created this video specifically for families. It was probably about 5 years ago now, and we've posted it on many of our websites, and we have provided an embed link to go along with it, as well as the full transcript available for everyone to see. So as you watch this video, I want you to think about a few things in terms of your local context. Are your districts and schools communicating about tiered systems of support with families in this way? And if not, how can the transcript be used and be helpful to you as a resource in developing more family-friendly communications around MTSS? So we're not going to show the whole video, but I'm going to just show a few minutes of it so you guys can get a sense of how we're trying to explain the intent and purpose of MTSS with our families.
Welcome to this brief overview of Florida's multi-tiered system of supports, which is also referred to as MTSS. The purpose of this overview is to increase the mutual understanding between family members, community members, and schools, because we have one thing in common. We all want students to be successful in school and in life. At the Florida Department of Education, we believe that when parents and educators form partnerships to support our students, the potential for our students to be successful and to reach learning goals is limitless. So a new way of thinking and working to help students is being used by schools throughout Florida and the United States. In Florida, we're calling it multi-tiered systems of supports. MTSS refers to a set of ideas focused on how to help all children be successful in school. It means your child's teacher and other educators are always asking themselves and each other, how well are the students responding to this instruction, and how can we make it better for them? It is not a program, strategy, or trend. Instead, it's a way of thinking and problem solving in order to figure out what kind of instruction each student responds to best. If the instruction a student is getting is not helping the student to learn, problem solving used within a multi-tiered system of support is a way of measuring progress and then making decisions about how to improve the instruction and add interventions that will help the student. If your child is having trouble meeting grade level learning expectations and is enrolled in a Florida public school, you should get information and be invited to participate in meetings to decide what interventions will be provided. When the type of help for your child increases or decreases based on how he or she responds to the instruction and interventions provided by the school, you will be part of the decision making. Depending on how often your child's responses are measured, you will get information, often drawn on a graph, about how your child is doing. This will help you understand whether the instruction and interventions are helping or not. If they are helping, the school will continue to monitor how your child is doing. If they are not helping, the teachers and specialists will invite you to work with them as they use the problem-solving process to improve the instruction and the interventions. The problem-solving process.
All right, we're just going to pause it there. It continues for another 10 minutes and goes into more detail about the problem-solving process, tiers of support, and more information about the connection with special education. It's a really great video. If you haven't watched the full thing, the link to it on our website is provided in the handout. If anyone has thoughts on developing something similar, please share that. I know a lot of other states have developed resources, videos, and things like that. If you have something that you wouldn't mind sharing with others, please go ahead and put the link in the chat box. If you have reactions in terms of whether or not your district or school or state is communicating about tiered systems of support with families in that way, or if you found it helpful, any of these reactions would be helpful in the chat box. So I'm going to kind of move along as those start to come in. This activity I've done a few times with different stakeholder groups, and it's been helpful to think through what it means and really working as a team to define what you hope to achieve from family engagement. So take a few seconds and just kind of sit with, what does family engagement mean to you and to your school or your district or your state, depending on the level that you're currently working in. What does it mean to you, and how do you know that you've achieved family engagement? So maybe when you heard about this webinar and thought this was something that your context really wanted to focus on, what specifically came to mind for you? And I see some people might be starting to type that in the chat box. I really appreciate that. You can think about what kinds of things people say to each other, what kinds of activities they engage in together, what it looks like to be engaged. And, we can kind of think about this in behavioral terms. Maybe also what it feels like to have families engaged. And what might be an indicator of success for your context? How do you know that you have engaged families? All right. Attendance at school events and parent trust. Those are always very, very important. Systematically gathering feedback from families. That's wonderful. And two-way forms of communication. Having relationships between the schools and family. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those in the chat box. If you haven't had an opportunity to do a similar activity with the teams within your context, it's helpful for you guys to be on the same page, create kind of a common vision for what you hope to achieve from family engagement. And this is often a helpful activity just to get started with thinking through your goals and using your goals that you hope to achieve from family engagement as a starting place to think about activities and actions and strategies for engaging families that are very much connected to the outcomes that you hope to achieve. So thanks again for sharing that in the chat box. I'm just going to spend the next few slides going over what are families and communities, and how do we define those. And it's really important to think about the language. Switching from parent to family seems minor, but it really opens up the opportunities for non-traditional roles that can support student learning. So it could be any adult in a child's life who has a vested interest in helping this child succeed. So you could think about aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, and really thinking about if it might be a kind of a non-traditional role for that student in terms of the relationship between the school and the family. For communities, we want to think about organizations and groups that value the importance of local schools achieving high outcomes, and that you've identified them as relevant stakeholders and have reached out and made connections with them. This is an interesting quote that I think kind of sets the stage for how we might think about family engagement a little bit differently. And it comes from ACSD. And this article, Hold the Line, Engagement Practices that Welcome Families from Poverty. If you haven't accessed that, it's a nice read and can kind of give you a different perspective on thinking about ways to engage with families. And the big takeaway here is that it says for a lot of families, you can't pick up the phone and expect that the number you called 2 weeks ago is still a working number. But you can't use that as an excuse not to engage. And this principal is sharing this. In fact, this teen's dad is very involved in his daughter's education. He just needs educators to be willing to pursue creative strategies for contacting him. So what they ended up working out was if she needs to get in touch with him, she calls a neighbor who takes the phone to him. So to me, that just really underscores the importance of not kind of taking a compliance perspective on family engagement, but more of an outcome-driven perspective on family engagement. And really thinking not just I've done my part, I made the call, or I sent the information home, but really taking it to the next step and thinking, did it work? Did my strategy reach the family? How might I engage in outreach efforts that are going to be successful for this family, and what does that really look like for them? So really going above and beyond and kind of thinking outside the box. All right, I think if it's okay, some of the images aren't showing up, so what I might just do is share my screen and put this on presentation mode really quickly. If you just give me 1 second. All right. Sorry about this. Some of the graphics aren't displaying here, so we want to make sure that you guys can see all of the graphics that are coming up. All right. So when we think about engagement, we really want to think about moving beyond kind of our traditional idea of volunteering and donations and some of the more traditional things of forms of family engagement that we often think about, and expanding that to include collaborative relationships that are based on trust, mutual respect, and understanding, and really focusing on those database conversations and problem-solving meetings that we're having, really that shared responsibility and understanding for student success. So the way in which we've worked to redefine family engagement, and I'm sure most of you on the webinar today are very familiar with Epstein's 5 forms or 6 forms of engagement, and now shifting away from more of those observable in the building kinds of engagement to things that may be less observable by educators, but are still just as important in terms of linking with student success, and those being those subtle forms of family engagement. And that really gets at conversations that are happening between parents and students that we may not be privy to, we may not know that are happening, but research has shown these conversations are extremely important in terms of predicting student outcomes. The collaborative problem solving aspects of family engagement are very important, and later in the webinar we'll kind of get into how these can look at Tier 1 as well as Tier 2 and Tier 3 as a main form of engagement with our families. And just as was shared earlier, that two-way communication is key. So the bidirectional communication and really rethinking not just sending information home, and kind of using this as a check that every time we do make information available, are we providing an opportunity for families to respond to that information? Whether that's asking questions, giving input, asking for more information, how are we also allowing for that bidirectional communication to occur? When we think about subtle forms of engagement, this is really the research behind those behaviors and those actions. And Janes is the primary researcher who's kind of coined that term, subtle forms of engagement. And I've provided links to some of his studies there for you. But when we think about subtle forms of engagement, we're really thinking about parents or family members essentially communicating the importance of and value of education with students, and their expectations for schooling, for education, for kind of that work ethic. And some of the research has used students reporting and what these researchers termed family effort, which was found to be predictive of student achievement outcomes. And that was defined as parent-child discussions about interests, topics studied in school, as well as courses that the students were taking. So I want you to think about, knowing the importance of subtle forms of engagement for student outcomes, how can we use student ratings of their conversations and how much families are communicating educational expectations with students as a measure of family engagement? So if we know that to be true, how can we go ahead and include that in our evaluation systems and reporting on family engagement? The two-way communication piece has been underscored for a long time in terms of a critical feature of family engagement, and that's why we see that oftentimes in federal and state policies. What's hyperlinked on this PowerPoint for you is just an overview of, I'm blanking on the number now, I think it's 50-some studies that they've reviewed in this manuscript, and goes through the important features of family engagement, finding that two-way communication piece is key to the effectiveness of strategies. Taking that a bit further, what research shows to be a critical feature of school reform, so sites that are successful in making those turnaround efforts, they find that trust among educators and families and stakeholders in the organization is a key feature of success, and trust is developed through that two-way communication. So you kind of get more in terms of contributing to student outcomes by focusing on that two-way communication. Collaborative problem solving is the third kind of critical feature, critical practice to think about integrating more of throughout your systems. It can be used to remove systematic barriers to family engagement. It can also be a strategy for working directly with families at Tier 1, 2, and 3. And I've included some links to resources and ideas for how to integrate some of that. The Academic Parent-Teacher Teams is a great resource if you haven't thought about how you can replicate that in your local sites. I really encourage you to look into that. It's essentially grade level data discussions with families, and then some skill building and resource development opportunities where you're giving families some strategies to work on with kids that's directly connected to the data that you've shared. The Learning Labs is an approach that includes equal numbers of family members and equal numbers of educators to work together in problem-solving teams and really focus on that disproportionate discipline data and going through that problem-solving process as partners and ensuring that we have equitable discipline practices in our systems. So I provided an overview there. The positive family support and the family checkup is another tiered approach to family engagement. And later in the session, in the presentation, I have his website available, and it goes through basically similar to the conjoint behavioral consultation and teachers and parents as partners, a problem-solving process with families to move through the data discussions, goal development, and interventions in a way that's very collaborative, that's strength-based, and really focused on ensuring that students are successful. Our specific work group and project really focuses on the term engagement rather than involvement or partnership to drive home the importance of educators' outreach to families as the primary mechanism for achieving family engagement. So research shows the more that educators are implementing effective outreach efforts for families, that's the strongest predictor of how engaged and responsive family members are with the schools. So it's really important to think about not only are you implementing these things, but are they effective, and how might our systems be able to kind of rethink what we're doing so that our strategies and approaches can be more effective. We really want to make sure that we are ensuring that by obtaining input from families from the beginning. And that input can really help inform communication preferences as well as ideas for how families want to be engaged, asking them, kind of what their preferences are for their roles in working with the school and supporting their student, how they like to receive information, their preferences for the frequency of information, and all of that, and using the school-wide data from families to then develop your goals and plans moving forward from there. And of course, everything that we are doing and working with families, we want to make sure that it's very closely connected with our larger school improvement goals connected to academic and behavioral outcomes. So really quickly, just going to go over the brief history of family engagement and how it's evolved over time. So this presentation is hyperlinked for you, and it really just set the stage for that national shift away from random acts of engagement and more event-based views of family engagement to that systemic thinking. And that really promoted the additional resources that were developed from there. This is a publication that was put out in 2010, and if you're really wanting some practical resources and tools for moving forward in a systemic way, very much connected to your larger system improvement goals, this is a very helpful resource for you to use in practice. And it essentially, as you can see in the image to the right, walks your system, whether that's at a district level or a school level, your leadership team through a problem-solving process that incorporates family perspectives and data to improve what's happening for families and schools in working together. This was published in 2013, and it's referred to as the Dual Capacity Building Framework for Family School Partnerships, and was published by the U.S. Department of Education to outline their framework, their systemic framework for families and schools working together. And you can see it really focuses on not just the capacity of families, but also that dual capacity. So how are we building capacity of educators to work in partnership with families to make sure that we are achieving our desired outcomes? So I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail. A big piece of that capacity building is the professional development and coaching that's connected to and focused on the relationships between home and school. And as a result, the Department of Ed has also put out a lot of webinars, information online. So in your handout, you'll notice that these are hyperlinked as well. And I encourage you to go to these websites and look through the information and the resources that they've made available because they are very helpful. So the framework just really starts by laying out the challenge for family engagement. And they've shifted our thinking away from deficit thinking about families to shifting that towards us thinking about the systems that we have in place. And then what we're doing to build the capacity of our systems to be able to engage in this work more effectively. The opportunity conditions set the context for the partnerships with families and really focusing on the relationship, making sure that we have those connections with student learning goals, and then building on the existing capital of our stakeholders in our group and increasing the connections among educators and families separately, but also together. So part of the capacity building is increasing family social connections and networks with one another so that they can have access to information. Things like due dates, resources for homework, community resources that are helpful for kids, all those kinds of tips and tricks is communicated and transmitted to families through those social networks. The policy and program goals go over the capabilities, connections, confidence, and cognition of those involved in the system. And again, really underscoring the importance of shifting away from just simply thinking about family engagement as how many parents came through the door to thinking about the components of partnership capacity for both families and educators and how well we're doing with that. The outcomes intended from this systemic framework is that families can negotiate multiple roles, and you see those listed there. And we also have schools and staff who can honor and recognize families' funds of knowledge, connect family engagement to student learning, and create welcoming and inviting cultures within their buildings. So as a result, since that was published, the Florida Positive Behavior Support Project, in collaboration with the RTI project, those both were referenced on the first slide of the session, decided to think through how are we helping our schools really engage in this systemic work focused on family engagement that's connected to the tiered systems of support they're already implementing. And this is where we went through the research and identified critical pieces of a systemic approach and thought through how they might fit within existing tiered systems of support. And what I'll outline in the next part of the session is the framework that was developed and some tools that we've either developed or made available through the hyperlinks for you to think through how you can create the features of this model within your local systems. So this slide just outlines how MTSS is defined in Florida, and we use these critical features to think through how are we implementing leadership, tiered instruction supports, problem-solving processes, and you'll notice the alignment between these features and the 6 critical elements of our family and community engagement model. So you see that leadership and the database outcomes is really the foundation of our framework. So thinking through, again, starting with that team and those goals and using that to inform how your tiered systems of support for families and what strategies you're using to engage them looks. So the remaining indicators are just those positive relationships, making sure you're taking a multidimensional, multi-tiered approach. You're empowering families, and that includes that strength-based approach to family engagement. And then lastly, using those collaborative problem-solving practices with families. So some of the guiding principles that we've outlined to help think how districts and schools can integrate and align what they're doing within existing systems of support is to make sure that you are being responsive to stakeholder needs. And again, that's a similar feature to your PBIS frameworks as well. You're being comprehensive. So you're connecting and aligning with your existing ways of work, initiatives, and goals. So if your PBIS team is meeting and going through Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 data, how is somebody on the team also thinking about the role families can play in those supports at each tier? And making sure that families have a voice in the practices that are happening in that building. Strategic, meaning that in the same way that we look at data for behavior to guide our practices and systems within our schools, how are we looking at family engagement and data and their input to develop our goals and then inform our practices that we're using to engage them and partner with them in ways that are connected to student learning? Relevant, and that goes back to that not just asking for donations or asking for volunteers to man the PBS store. That's a potential role. But how are we really engaging in meaningful partnerships and stakeholder involvement in ways that's connected to student learning goals, and how we can help obtain information from families to make our practices more effective, but also use that information in our work with them. It's going to take a second. Just kind of revisit the chat box, make sure there's nothing I missed. If there is, feel free to jump in on the mic. So the systemic efforts for family engagement are also outlined in the PBIS ebook that was recently published, and just kind of goes through the stages of implementation connected to some of these key features of a systemic approach to family engagement. So if you're wanting kind of a read, that's hyperlinked there for you. So if you don't take anything else away from this webinar other than the importance of starting with mutually developed goals for family engagement, I'll be okay with that. I really encourage you to think about how you are getting input and perspectives from families as part of your planning for how you're going to engage them. Again, helping them, giving them an opportunity to kind of co-define their role and what engagement means within your buildings, so that you're not engaging in practices and developing resources and scheduling events that aren't meaningful to your families, that aren't kind of what they're hoping for from you. I'll give you an example. I was working with a district who wanted to improve family engagement, and part of the team members identified, let's develop this online system so that families can just access the data that we're monitoring for our Tier 2 and Tier 3 behavioral interventions. And the team got really excited and started planning how they were going to, who they were going to contract with and how they were going to get this developed. And I just asked, do your families have access to internet at home? Do they have computers? Do they log in frequently? Is that going to be helpful to them? And they weren't able to answer any of those questions. And that's kind of where we sat and thought, why don't we ask them, how do you want this information about student progress data? How would you like us to communicate with you? How frequently would you like that information? And so that we're not investing in all these resources that are ultimately going to end up being ineffective in terms of reaching our families. So again, co-developing those goals and being very explicit in kind of clarifying and understanding one another and our intent in working together. Making our environments very welcoming and helping to reach out and make sure that families know that they're welcomed. And you can do that in a lot of ways, through being dependable, consistent in your communications. Every time that they do end up visiting this school, how can you encourage that and make them feel like they're part of the family that is that school? The transparency is another big one. That positive, ongoing communication, making sure that we are being upfront with families, being proactive in our communication. So that's a big one. We always hear that, from families. We didn't hear from the school until there was a problem, or until the student was suspended, or, and at that point, it's very challenging to build in those positive relationships. So how can we make those phone calls from the beginning of the year to just, pick up the phone and let the families know that you're excited about the school year, interested in getting to know them and their child, and working through some of those communication preferences at that point as well. When I've encouraged principals to do that, a couple of our schools have spent a lot of time planning this summer, the follow through. That's going to go along with those phone calls. So principals are already planning, how am I going to check the call logs after the first month of school and make sure and recognize those teachers who did end up making those calls. We have another school who's going to really spend a lot of time going over that script and making that available to teachers in the beginning of the year, so that teachers have kind of a checklist of things that they need to cover with families when they make those calls. This is a tool that we developed to outline the critical features of our systemic approach to family engagement. It's an innovation configuration. Don't tell anyone I said this, but you can think of it like a self-assessment. It's definitely not. It's intended to help communicate the idea of family engagement in a broader, more systemic way. But you as a team can use this to think through, where are you in implementing a lot of these key features? So that's hyperlinked for you. So the leadership and goal development, again, is kind of the foundation and a good place to start, and thinking about how the leadership team is establishing that priority and really integrating families within the existing teaming structure. So for those on the webinar, if you could, in the chat box, just kind of think through how your schools are currently creating this priority and integrating families within your existing teaming structures. If you have any schools that are doing this well or creatively, please feel free to share that. What's hyperlinked on the slide here is a resource for principals, and it just shares their success stories about engaging families. Oh, Sherry, thanks for your input on the innovation configuration. Sherry is with the Midwest PBS project, and we were able to use that with some of her schools to help them kind of see where they're at. So I'm happy to hear that you're continuing to find it helpful. One of the things that I really advocate is that even though families may not physically be able to be at the building and attending your team meetings, think about integration of families in terms of their voice, their perspective, assigning someone on the team a role that's kind of deemed a parent advocate, and it's their job on the team to think about how are we obtaining family input and using that in our problem-solving process. These are some free surveys, hyperlinked for you, and these can be used to get input from your staff and from your families. There's an educator version and a family version, and it measures their beliefs about family engagement, both educators and families, their knowledge, skills, and practices. And if this is something of interest to you that you have, and you also have a SurveyMonkey account, it's available in SurveyMonkey, and we can dump it right into your account, and you can disseminate it how you would like. So that's a resource. This is hyperlinked, and it's a wonderful article that goes through how to different questions to think about, preferences from families. What asking them their communication preferences, relationship building preferences, informational needs, and can help you give you some different and creative ideas about how you can get the information out and get information from families as well. This is hyperlinked as well, and it's a beginning of the year parent questionnaire. And what I like about this is that it gives families and kids a way to talk together about and have these conversations together in terms of what they're looking forward to for the school year. And I thought these were some great questions. For those that are attending live today, if you have any other questions that your teams are using with families in the beginning of the year, just to kind of get to know them, and if you have any ideas for creative strategies for engaging families who might need a little bit more intensive outreach, feel free to type those as well. Some of our districts, we're encouraging them to include, include opportunities for talking with families about these questions during registration, packets that are mailed out, back to school nights, beginning of the year processes. How can you include more of these questionnaires into that existing way of work? If you're interested in more questions for families, there's some free PBS-like questions that are hyperlinked there, as well as another free survey measuring family-school relationships. In terms of building capacity, in the districts and schools I worked with, many of them say professional development is very much needed, focused on family engagement. So if this is an area of need for your state or district, what's on the screen now are the 2002 Futures School Site Conference put together a lot of free resources focused on family engagement, professional development. So if you go to these sites, what you'll see is scripted PowerPoints with presenter notes, handouts and activities that are really all developed for you and essentially could be downloaded and used by a leadership team in a staff meeting and in a grade level meeting as a professional learning community. The resources are made very easy for you to use. These are some national resources that are hyperlinked. The National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement puts out a lot of great webinars. That's hyperlinked. They're talking about district-wide strategies for building capacity. Just some various handouts that you can start to think about how you might disseminate more information related to family engagement to the educators in your building. Again, getting input from families to develop your goals. And thinking about the existing data that you already have available or access to in order to inform some kind of where you're at now with family engagement. So what's listed on the slide are just some ideas if you're using the BOQ or the TFI or the PIC or the TIC, how you might be able to use some of those items to measure where you're at with that. Additional resources for collecting data related to family engagement goals. A personal favorite of mine is the classroom family engagement rubric. I've had school teams kind of put this out to teachers in the beginning of the year and have them self-assess where they're at with some of these practices. It's also just a good beginning of the year reminder that a lot of these things should be happening with educators and families throughout the year. So once your team has your input and your goals, you can move forward with implementing practices and strategies that are really going to be effective in helping you to achieve that. The positive relationships is kind of that next layer of the foundation. The most important thing is our mindset. We have to absolutely believe in our souls that families want to support their children and that partnerships can make a significant difference. That's a nice quote from Henderson and Mapp. If you're interested in having those discussions around beliefs and values related to family engagement, this is a mindset diagnostic from the Parent Engagement Toolkit from Boston Public Schools, and it's hyperlinked for you. And just sitting down as a team, talking through some of these beliefs has been helpful for some of our school teams to have some of those difficult conversations in terms of, do we really value this, and how are we making sure that families know and feel valued in this way. Making personal introductions and relationship building a priority with families before issues arise. So some guiding questions on this slide is just, and you guys can type into the chat box if you have ideas that you're currently doing or that you've thought about. But how can your team ensure teachers make personal connections, and especially prioritizing the disconnected families within the first couple of weeks of school? So if you know families, some of the families have challenging relationships with some of the staff members in the school, or if no one on the staff is able to say, I have a positive relationship with this family, that might be an area to start. You know, how can we identify almost a educator mentor, if you will, to that family to really help them feel connected, at least to someone in the building. And then how can you use your support staff or itinerant staff in creative ways? They have more flexible scheduling to really go and engage in some of those more resource-intensive ways of engaging families. So whether that's a home visit or maybe meeting families in a community setting, you know, how can we use those folks in ways that are really more strategically connected to the families who need it the most? Ensuring a transparent and welcoming environment. There's a couple slides ago, there's a very short video clip that schools are using to train their secretaries and front office staff on just how to establish that welcoming environment when you step into the building. Most recently, we're finding that maintaining updated information for that two-way communication is a really big challenge. So some of our families are have reported that they feel it's very difficult to keep their information updated in the school system. So thinking through how you can plan proactively to ensure that families and educators have updated information for one another. And if you have other ideas, please type those in the chat box. The next feature of our framework is really that multidimensional, multi-tiered approach. So there's an activity for you here, an example of one, to think through what you're currently doing at Tier 1, 2, and 3 to engage families in ways that's connected with your tiered systems of support for students. So if you're able to articulate kind of what's going on at each tier to engage families, connected to what you're doing for students, I encourage you to think through the next question in terms of how well are the strategies working and how do you know? And really making sure that you're able to say, you know, the bidirectional communication for our students on check-in, check-out is working because we have 90% of our slips that come back with signatures, and kind of thinking about how you're using that data to monitor what's working and what's not. Communicating about tiered systems of support with your families. These are some hyperlinked resources on the website that can give you some ideas about how you might do that. Megan McCarthy is a guidance counselor. I think she's a social worker at Churchville Middle in Illinois, and has created a wonderful website. They implement the positive family support model, and she's made their website very family friendly and accessible with a lot of information. A lot of the resources that she's also presented on the positive family support and the family checkup model. So that's the hyperlink on the right-hand image that you see here. She's provided an overview. So if you're interested in more information, I encourage you to watch that overview that's hyperlinked. This slide is just emphasizing that using the family input to inform tiered supports for students. So the positive family support model is one strategy to do that, and I provided links to a presentation that was provided at the forum, and you can get more information there. But essentially, the Parent Readiness Screener and the Midwest PBS Projects, thanks Sherry, has made this available on their website, so the hyperlink is there, and you can use that readiness screener to engage in problem-solving conversations with families more effectively. Some ideas here on the slide are encouraging you to think about how you're empowering family strengths, identifying their strengths and using that in the curriculum, and also helping to provide some information to families around what PBS is, how it looks in the school, how they can engage in that with their students. So some resources for you to think about how you can do that with families. I encourage you to also, as you give information about PBS to your families, how can you ask them for their input? Asking them, do the expectations, what are their thoughts on the expectations? Do they make sense to them? Do they have ideas for other terms or other ways of communicating about the expectations that make more sense to them and their kids or their culture? Making sure that you're using their input to drive what you're doing in the building. And finally, the collaborative problem solving is a really effective strategy for having conversations with families and moving through oftentimes some of the difficult conversations, whether that's a behavior incident that occurred or underperformance academically. Kind of gets you through the problem-solving steps. So here's the area of concern, and it goes through next, why do we think it's happening? Getting families' perspectives, educators sharing their perspectives, and then moving into, okay, what's our plan? How are we going to work on this together? So it's helpful in moving from and not just sitting in that problem admiration phase almost, and it helps you to get to a resolution and a plan for what you're going to do together to support student learning. So on this slide, I've just given you some access to resources and how those problem-solving conversations can look at school-wide and Tier 1, as well as those additional, more intensive tiers of support. So I'm going to check and see now, because I had to switch away from, let's see if I can do this again. Share the document now. Unfortunately, I had another video to show you, but it's looking like it didn't upload in time. I was hoping I was going to get an opportunity to show you a small clip from some of the work that we're doing with families around equity. So we're really focused on supporting our school districts address disproportionate discipline. And as part of step 2 of that problem-solving process, we've helped our districts and our schools get input from families, families' perspectives on why disproportionate's happening, their ideas for addressing it. And so we'll be sharing more of that at the forum in September, so I encourage you to come to our session and learn more about that process. It's been especially helpful for our schools and our students, having family input and using that moving forward. And then again, finally, thinking about sustainability. So again, revisiting, did what we planned to do, did we do it? And was it effective in terms of, did it work in reaching our goals and reaching our families? And if not, how can we do things differently? So the summary from today is just really moving away from compliance-driven family engagement to outcome-driven family engagement. So not just stopping at, we sent the information home or we posted it on the website, or we made the call but they didn't return it, and really thinking about asking, why didn't the strategy work and what might we be able to do differently? And kind of sitting back as a team and evaluating, are the efforts kind of hitting the mark? And if not, how might we ask families what we can do differently to be more effective? Getting to know your families personally, establishing those positive relationships, showing concern, showing respect, and establishing that there's really a value for their partnership in ways that's connected to student learning. Asking questions, asking for family input, and things aren't going well, ask for ideas of how it could be better, how it could be different, and then just being creative. So going back to that first quote that was shared in the beginning of the webinar, how can we kind of think outside the box for what we're doing to reach out to families and engage them and do things that we might not have thought before. So in closing, I leave you with some of those thoughts. If anyone has questions or comments, we have a few minutes to address those. I appreciate your time and everyone's engagement in the chat box today. It was really, really nice.